August 20th, 1945. A young Japanese nurse named Keiko Yamada stood on the deck of an American transport ship, staring at a breakfast plate that made her cry. Not because she was hungry, but because everything she'd been told about America was a lie. On that metal tray sat 3 strips of bacon, 2 fried eggs, white bread with butter, and a cup of coffee with real sugar. For most Americans, this was just breakfast. For Keiko, it was the moment her entire world began to crack open. What she would discover at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, would shatter not just her beliefs but those of 288 other Japanese women. And the story would change how they saw their own country forever. But first you need to understand where she came from. If you or your father served in the Pacific, you'll want to hear this story. Hit that like button and let's remember what really happened. July 1945. Guam. The war was ending, but nobody had told Keiko and her fellow nurses that surrender was coming. They huddled in caves carved into volcanic rock, listening to the thunder of American artillery getting closer each day. The smell of damp stone and rotting vegetation filled their lungs. Rats scurried in the darkness. Water dripped from the ceiling, a constant rhythm that marked time in a place where days and nights blurred together. Keiko's skin had cracked from malnutrition. Her uniform, once crisp and white, hung on her frame like a burial shroud. At night, her stomach cramped so violently she had to bite down on her sleeve to keep from screaming. The last meal she remembered clearly was 3 weeks ago. Rice mixed with sawdust. The grains crunched between her teeth, and the wood splinters cut her gums until she tasted blood with every swallow. But Keiko believed. She had to believe. The loudspeaker crackled to life each morning, a Japanese officer's voice echoing through the cave system. American soldiers are weak and starving. Their industries have collapsed. Hold on just a little longer. Victory is coming. The Emperor will prevail. Keiko pressed her hand against the rough stone wall and nodded. She had never left Japan before the war. She had no reason to doubt. Her instructors at nursing school in Yokohama had shown her propaganda films. American soldiers stumbling thin as reeds, their faces hollow with hunger. American cities burning. American children begging for rice. She believed because not believing meant her brother had died for nothing. In exactly 10 days, Keiko would take her first bite of American bacon. And that single bite would destroy everything she thought she knew. But the journey there would be even more shocking. Keiko Yamada was 23 years old, born and raised in Yokohama, the daughter of a potter. Her father made tea bowls so thin you could see light through them. Her mother painted cherry blossoms on ceramic vases that sold to wealthy families in Tokyo. They were not rich, but they were proud. Proud of their craft, proud of their country, proud of their son who volunteered to fight at Saipan. June 1944. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning. Keiko's mother collapsed in the garden. Her father stood perfectly still, holding the thin paper, reading the same 3 lines over and over. Your son died with honor. He fought bravely for the Emperor. His sacrifice will never be forgotten. Keiko found a letter her brother had written 2 weeks before he died. The paper was stained with something dark. Sweat, maybe, or blood. She never knew. His handwriting was shaky, the characters barely legible. But the final line was clear. Little sister, whatever happens to me, remember this. Never trust the Western devils. They will tell you lies. They will promise you mercy. But they are demons in human skin. Fight until the end. She folded that letter and tucked it into the inside pocket of her uniform over her heart. She touched it every morning when she woke up. She touched it every night before she slept. She touched it now sitting in the cave on Guam, listening to the bombs fall closer. Never trust the Western devils. Hana Tanaka was 20 years old and she was starting to doubt. She came from Tokyo from a family of scholars. Her father was a university professor who taught history and philosophy. Before the war, he would sit with Ohana in his study surrounded by books in Japanese, Chinese, and English, and he would teach her to question everything. The mark of an educated mind, he said, is the ability to entertain a thought without accepting it. Then the war came. The military police visited twice. They warned her father about his dangerous ideas. They confiscated his English books. They told him to stop teaching his daughter to think like a man. In February 1945, they pulled Hana out of medical school in her 3rd year. She was sent to Guam to work as a medical assistant to help treat wounded soldiers who kept arriving in greater and greater numbers. Soldiers with shattered bones and infected wounds and eyes that had seen too much death. Hana kept a small notebook hidden in the lining of her shoe. She wrote in it using a code her father taught her when she was 12. A simple substitution cipher. Nothing sophisticated, but enough to keep her thoughts private. And her thoughts were becoming dangerous. She had watched the war turn. She had seen the steady retreat island by island, defeat by defeat. She had listened to officers curse and rage and blame subordinates for failures that seemed inevitable. The propaganda radio kept insisting Japan was winning, but the wounded kept arriving. More wounded. Always more wounded. When the announcement came on August 15th that Japan had surrendered, Hana felt something strange. Not grief, not shock, relief. And then immediately after relief, a cold stab of fear. Because if surrender was a relief, did that mean she had stopped believing? And if she had stopped believing, what did that make her? Yuki Nakamura was 28 years old, and she refused to accept reality. She came from Osaka from a merchant family that had prospered before the war. Her father sold silk. Her mother arranged flowers for tea ceremonies. Yuki learned to read English in school, studied radio operation, and was recruited by the military to work in communications. She intercepted American radio transmissions, helped decode simple messages, and listened to enemy chatter through crackling headphones. She was good at her job, proud of it. She believed absolutely in Japanese superiority. The Americans were crude, materialistic, obsessed with comfort and money. They had no discipline, no honor, no understanding of sacrifice. They might have more ships and more planes, but they lacked the spiritual strength that made Japan invincible. Even now, even after surrender, Yuki clung to this belief. The Americans had won through trickery. Through overwhelming industrial production, yes, but that only proved they were slaves to material things. In matters of spirit, of culture, of true civilization, Japan remained supreme. She refused to look American soldiers in the eye. She considered it a form of spiritual surrender. She would be a prisoner of their bodies, yes, but never a prisoner of their ideas. On the morning of August 20th, 89, Japanese women stood in a ragged line at the port in Guam. Most were nurses. Some were communications workers like Yuki. A few were students who had been conscripted into auxiliary roles. All of them were terrified. Rumors had spread through the caves. The Americans would throw them into the ocean. The Americans would experiment on them. The Americans would do worse things, things whispered about in darkness, things that made young women press their hands over their mouths to keep from sobbing. An American transport ship sat in the harbor, gray and enormous. Keiko had never seen a ship that large. It looked like a floating building, impossibly huge, impossibly solid. American soldiers stood at the gangplank directing the women aboard. Keiko watched them carefully, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been taught. The propaganda cartoons had shown Americans as stooped, weak men with soft hands and vacant eyes. But the soldier in front of her stood at least 6 feet tall. His shoulders were broad. His uniform was clean and pressed. His boots shone in the morning sun. When he gestured for the women to move forward, his arm was steady muscled, radiating a casual confidence that Keiko had only seen in the most elite Japanese officers. One woman near the front of the line screamed when the soldier reached out to help her up the steep gangplank. She thought he was going to strike her. Instead, he steadied her elbow and said something in English, his voice surprisingly gentle. The interpreter, a Japanese-American man in his 40s, translated, "Watch your step, ma'am. It's slippery." Ma'am. Keiko had never heard an enemy soldier call a prisoner ma'am. The ship's interior was clean. Not spotless, not luxurious, but clean in a way that shocked Keiko to her core. The metal walls had been scrubbed. The floors were free of rust and grime. The bunks where the women would sleep had actual mattresses, thin but real and clean, white sheets and gray wool blankets. A young sailor, barely 20 years old, distributed the blankets. He smiled at each woman as he handed them out. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, just a smile, as if this were normal. As if giving blankets to enemy prisoners was the most natural thing in the world. Keiko accepted her blanket and ran her hand over the fabric. It was softer than anything she had owned at home, softer than her mother's best winter coat, softer than the blanket she had slept under as a child. She sat on her bunk and pressed the wool against her face and cried. Not from fear, from confusion. Nothing was making sense. The smell hit her first. It was morning, the first morning aboard the ship, and Keiko woke to a scent so powerful and so foreign that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. It smelled like meat, like fat rendering, like something cooking that her body recognized on an animal level as food. Real food, not roots, not sawdust. Food. The sound came next, the clatter of metal trays, the murmur of American voices, the sizzle of something frying in a pan. Keiko followed the smell and the sound down a narrow corridor to a mess hall where long tables had been set up. American sailors sat at some tables eating breakfast and talking. At other tables, Japanese women huddled together, staring at the trays in front of them with expressions of disbelief. Keiko got in line. A cook, a large man with forearms like tree trunks, scooped food onto her tray. Bacon, 3 strips glistening with grease, 2 fried eggs, the yolks still runny, 2 slices of white bread, a pat of butter, a tin cup of coffee, a small bowl of sugar. She carried her tray to a table and sat down. Around her, women whispered frantically. A girl barely 19 years old named Michiko was crying. "It's a trick. They want us to age so we'll let our guard down. Then they'll poison us." Yuki, sitting 2 tables away, spoke loudly. "This is psychological warfare. They want us to feel indebted. They want us to believe Japan was wrong to ration food. Don't fall for it." Hana said nothing. She just stared at her tray, her mind working through the implications. If this was standard food for prisoners, what did American soldiers eat? If this was how they fed people they had defeated, how did they feed their own children? Keiko picked up a strip of bacon. The grease coated her fingers. She brought it to her lips. The smell made her dizzy. She bit down. The taste exploded in her mouth. Salt, fat, smoke. Richness so profound it was almost painful. Her body, starved for months, roared with sudden desperate hunger. She chewed slowly, tears streaming down her face. It was real. This wasn't theater. This wasn't a trick. This was just breakfast. And if this was just breakfast, then every single thing she had been told about America was a lie. That bacon changed something in Keiko, but she wasn't ready to admit it yet. What she would see in 3 days would force her to face a truth even harder to swallow than American food. Over the next 2 days, the resistance crumbled. The first day, about 50 women refused to eat. They sat at the tables with their arms crossed, glaring at the food as if it were an insult. But by evening, the smell was too much. One by one, they picked up their forks. One by one, they tasted eggs and bread and meat. One by one, they started to cry. The second day, maybe 10 women still refused. Yuki was one of them. But even she was weakening. Keiko saw her staring at the bacon, her jaw clenched, her hands trembling. "This is what they want," Yuki muttered. "They want us to feel ashamed that our country couldn't feed us. They want us to abandon our pride." Hana, sitting across from Yuki, spoke quietly. "Or maybe they're just feeding us because that's what they do with prisoners. Maybe it's not about shame. Maybe it's just about decency." Yuki's head snapped up. "Decency? They dropped fire on our cities. They killed hundreds of thousands. And you call that decency?" Hana didn't answer. She just wrote in her hidden notebook. "If they're feeding us to make us feel Japan was poor, why is it working?" The third day, Michiko ate too much. She had gone from refusing to eat to eating with a desperation that worried Keiko. 3 plates of eggs, 4 pieces of toast, 6 strips of bacon. Her stomach, shrunken from months of starvation, couldn't handle it. By midday, she was doubled over, screaming, clutching her abdomen as cramps ripped through her. Keiko ran for help. Within minutes, an American medic appeared. Corporal Davis, age 24, from Ohio. He knelt beside Michiko, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he pressed his palm against her forehead to check for fever. His voice was calm. "It's okay. You're okay. Just ate too much, too fast. It happens." He gave her medicine for the pain, warm water to sip slowly. He sat with her for 2 hours, monitoring her pulse, making sure she didn't vomit, speaking softly even though she couldn't understand his words. Keiko watched all of this in stunned silence. She had seen Japanese officers step over wounded soldiers to avoid the inconvenience of helping them. She had seen doctors ignore patients who weren't important enough to waste supplies on. But this American medic sat with an enemy prisoner, a girl who had been taught to hate him just to make sure she was okay. When Michiko finally fell asleep, Corporal Davis stood and stretched. He caught Keiko's eye and nodded. Just a simple nod. Acknowledgement between two medical professionals. Then he left. Keiko sat beside Machiko's bunk for the rest of the afternoon. She touched the letter in her pocket, her brother's final words. Never trust the Western devils. But her brother had never met Corporal Davis. Her brother had never seen this. She would remember this moment 6 months later when she would have to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. But on that ship, she just watched and wondered. My grandfather was a Navy corpsman in the Pacific. If your family has similar stories, drop them in the comments. Let's honor that generation together. Day 10, August 30th, 1945. Dawn broke over San Francisco Bay. The fog was thick, rolling in from the Pacific in great gray waves. The women stood on deck, wrapped in blankets, shivering in air colder than anything they had ever felt. Keiko had never experienced cold like this. In Japan, summer was hot and humid. In Guam, it was hotter. But this California morning cut through her clothes and settled in her bones. Then the fog began to lift. And there, rising out of the mist like something from a dream, was the Golden Gate Bridge. Keiko had seen photographs. Grainy black and white images in newspapers, usually with captions about American decadence and waste. But photographs couldn't capture this. The bridge stretched across the bay, impossibly long, impossibly high, its towers reaching into the sky like the pillars of a temple built by giants. The cables swooped in perfect arcs. The roadway hung suspended over water, so blue it hurt to look at. How? The word escaped Keiko's lips before she could stop it. How does a country that's collapsing build something like this? Hana stood beside her, staring. She pulled out her notebook and started writing frantically, not even bothering to use her code. Just raw observations. Bridge estimated 1.7 miles long. Suspension cables, steel construction. Completed 1937 according to what I read before the war. This required engineering resources, labor coordination. This required a country with surplus. This required a country that wasn't just surviving, but thriving. The ship moved slowly into the harbor. More impossible sights appeared. Dozens of ships. Not warships preparing for battle, but cargo ships, tankers, fishing boats, ferries moving back and forth in an endless rhythm of commerce and daily life. Cranes lined the docks, moving containers with mechanical precision. Warehouses stretched along the waterfront. Trucks waited in organized lines. Hana started counting. 1, 2, 3. Her voice rose. 20, 30. She stopped at 47. 47 large ships just in their immediate view, more than the entire remaining Japanese Navy. She turned to Keiko, her face pale. We had no chance from the very beginning. We never had a chance. The city rose behind the docks. Buildings. Not the low wooden structures of Japanese cities, but towers of steel and concrete and glass climbing 10 stories, 15 stories, 20 stories into the sky. Keiko tried to compare them to anything in Tokyo. Nothing compared. The tallest building she had ever seen in Japan was maybe 6 stories. Here, buildings twice that height seemed commonplace, ordinary, unremarkable. Streets crisscrossed the hills packed with automobiles. Not military vehicles, just regular cars. Civilian cars, more cars in one glance than Keiko had seen in her entire life in Yokohama. People walked on the sidewalks, going about their morning business. They looked healthy, well-fed. Their clothes were clean and whole. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stood at the edge of the dock eating an ice cream cone. Just standing there, licking ice cream on a Thursday morning as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He was taller and heavier than most 20-year-old Japanese soldiers Keiko had treated. His cheeks were round, his arms were sturdy. He looked like he had never missed a meal in his entire life. Yuki stood at the railing, gripping the metal so hard her knuckles turned white. She was staring at something on the dock. A poster. A war bonds poster, probably left over from the war effort, showing an American factory worker, muscular and confident, standing in front of an assembly line producing tanks. The text read, "Production wins wars." Keiko watched Yuki's face change. Watched the certainty crack. Watched doubt seep in like water through a failing dam. Their propaganda about themselves, Yuki whispered, was true. Our propaganda about them was false. For the first time since Keiko had known her, Yuki was silent. Completely, utterly silent. The women were loaded onto buses, clean buses with padded seats and windows that opened and closed smoothly. The buses drove through the city, and the women pressed their faces to the glass like children. Stores with windows full of goods, clothing, shoes, household items, food, so much food. Bakeries with bread stacked in the windows. Butcher shops with cuts of meat hanging on hooks. Produce stands with pyramids of apples and oranges, and vegetables Keiko couldn't even name. Children played in a park running and laughing. Not one of them looked hungry. Not one of them looked sick. They just looked like children playing on a normal day, in a normal city, in a country that had just won a war, without seeming to suffer at all. Keiko pressed her hand against the window. We fought this. At the train station, a Red Cross volunteer approached. An older woman, maybe 50, with gray hair and kind eyes. She handed out sandwiches and bottles of soda for the long train journey ahead. When she gave Keiko her sandwich, she spoke through the interpreter. You poor girls look so thin. Please eat. You need your strength. There was no malice in her voice. No satisfaction at having defeated an enemy. Just simple human concern. She looked at Keiko the way Keiko's own mother might look at a hungry child, with compassion. Keiko took the sandwich. Inside was thick, sliced ham, cheese, lettuce, tomato. She unwrapped it slowly, her hands shaking. The woman smiled. It's okay, honey, eat. The train pulled out of the station. Keiko bit into her sandwich. The bread was soft. The ham was real thick, salty, nothing like the scraps she had eaten in Guam. The cheese was smooth and rich. She chewed slowly, trying to make it last, trying to understand how this could be ordinary food for ordinary people. The train rolled east through California. The women sat in silence, watching America pass by the windows. Farmland stretched to the horizon. Fields of wheat golden in the late summer sun. Orchards heavy with fruit. Cattle grazing on hillsides so vast they seemed to go on forever. One cow Keiko thought staring at a herd in a pasture. One of those cows eats more food than a Japanese family consumed in a month during the war. Maybe more. As the train crossed into Nevada, the sun set behind them, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Keiko leaned her head against the window, exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. How long had they known the generals, the politicians, the emperor himself? How long had they known that this war was unwinnable? How long had they sent men to die and women to starve for a victory that was always impossible? Hana sat across from her, writing in her notebook by the faint light of the train's overhead bulbs. Keiko didn't need to ask what she was writing. She knew. Hana was documenting everything. Every shock, every realization, every crack in the foundation of what they had believed. Yuki sat alone in the back of the car, staring out the window at nothing. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were arguing with someone who wasn't there. Herself, probably. The internal war between what she had believed and what she was being forced to see. The train rumbled through the night. Outside, the vast American darkness stretched away in all directions. But here and there, lights appeared. Small towns, isolated farms. Electric lights burning bright in the middle of nowhere, as if electricity were so abundant, so cheap, that people could waste it just to keep the night at bay. The interpreter, Mr. Hayashi, walked through the car, checking on the women. He stopped beside Keiko. How are you holding up? Keiko looked up at him. Mr. Hayashi, when did you come to America? 1920, I was 15. And you stayed, even though you're Japanese. I'm American, he corrected gently. I was born in Japan, but I'm American now. Why? He sat down across from her. Because America, for all its flaws, told me I could be whatever I wanted to be if I worked hard enough. And mostly that turned out to be true. He paused. Your country told you lies, Keiko. I'm sorry, but now you get to see the truth. What you do with that truth is up to you. He stood and continued down the car. Keiko watched him go, then looked down at her hands. Hands that had treated wounded soldiers who died anyway. Hands that had been taught to serve an empire that fed its people sawdust and called it loyalty. She touched the empty pocket where her brother's letter used to be. She had taken it out that morning and held it over the side of the ship, ready to let it go. But she couldn't, not yet. She had folded it carefully and tucked it back into her uniform. She wasn't ready to let go of her brother, but she was starting to let go of his words. The train rolled on through the American night, carrying 289 Japanese women toward a place called Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Toward showers with unlimited hot water. Toward food they couldn't imagine. toward a reckoning with truth that would change them forever. The train crossed into Wisconsin on September 3rd, 1945. 3 days of constant emotion. 3 days of watching America unfold like a map that kept revealing more impossible details. Through Nebraska's endless grasslands where cattle outnumbered people. Through Iowa's cornfields that stretched beyond the horizon so vast that Keiko stopped trying to see where they ended. Through small towns with neat white houses and churches with tall steeples and main streets lined with the shops that looked prosperous even in the early morning light. The landscape changed as they entered Wisconsin. Dense forests of pine and oak pressed close to the tracks. Lakes appeared like mirrors dropped into the green reflecting clouds and sky. The air coming through the train windows carried a scent Keiko had never encountered before. Cool, clean, sharp with the smell of pine needles and earth and something else she couldn't identify. Later, she would learn it was the scent of a place where water was abundant, where nothing had to fight quite so hard to survive. The women had been quiet for hours, that heavy silence that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having too much. Hana filled another page in her notebook. Yuki stared out the window with eyes that saw but didn't blink. Michiko slept with her head against the glass, her face peaceful for the first time since Guam. Camp McCoy appeared through the trees without warning. Guard towers, but no machine guns mounted in them. Fences topped with barbed wire, but the gates stood open. Long wooden barracks painted a dull green. A water tower with the camp's name painted in white letters 20 feet high. An American flag snapping in the wind on a pole that seemed absurdly tall. The train hissed to a stop. Soldiers appeared, not threatening, just efficiently directing the women to form lines. Their movements were practiced, professional, almost bored. This was routine for them. Just another group of prisoners arriving at just another camp on just another Tuesday afternoon. But for Keiko, stepping off that train onto Wisconsin soil felt like stepping onto another planet. A woman in a military uniform approached. Older, maybe 45, with iron gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her uniform was crisp despite the afternoon heat. Her posture was straight without being rigid. She carried herself with the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. Lieutenant Margaret Wilson, chief nurse, the woman who would run their lives for the next 8 months. She spoke through Mr. Hayashi, her voice calm and measured. Welcome to Camp McCoy. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity and respect. No one here will harm you. You will be given housing, food, medical care, and the opportunity to work if you choose. If you have any problems or concerns, you may bring them to me or any member of my staff. Do you understand? The women nodded, unsure what else to do. Good. Follow Sergeant Miller. He'll show you to your quarters. Quarters. Not cells, not pens. Quarters. The barracks were simple wooden structures raised slightly off the ground on concrete blocks. Inside, rows of metal frame beds lined both walls, each with a mattress, a pillow, 2 blankets, and a footlocker. Bare light bulbs hung from the ceiling every 10 feet. Windows along both sides could be opened to let in the breeze. The floor was clean swept recently, smelling faintly of pine soap. Keiko chose a bed near the middle of the room. She sat on the mattress and pressed down with her hand. It gave slightly, not soft exactly, but not hard either. She lay back and stared at the ceiling. The mattress held her weight without complaint. She could stretch out fully. Her feet didn't hang off the end. There was room. This is better than my bed at home, Michiko whispered from the next bunk. No one disagreed because it was true. A young woman in a different uniform appeared in the doorway. Not military exactly, something else. She wore a gray dress with a white collar and a small pin that said, Matron. Betty Morrison, age 35, from Milwaukee. Her face was round and friendly, her smile genuine, as she addressed the group through the interpreter. Ladies, if you'd like to shower and change into clean clothes, the washroom is through that door. Take your time. Use as much hot water as you need. One of the women raised her hand timidly. She spoke in Japanese. Mr. Hayashi translated. How long are we permitted to shower? Betty looked confused. Until you're clean, honey, however long that takes. The woman persisted. Is there a time limit? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Betty's confusion deepened. No, dear. No time limit. Just use what you need. The women looked at each other. Several faces showed open disbelief. Yuki muttered something that sounded like impossible, but she didn't say it loudly. The washroom was a long rectangle with white tile walls and a concrete floor that sloped slightly toward drains. 20 shower heads protruded from the walls at regular intervals. Benches ran down the middle of the room. Shelves held folded towels and bars of white soap. Everything was clean. Institutional, yes, but meticulously maintained. Keiko turned on one of the shower taps. Water sputtered, coughed, then began to flow. She adjusted the temperature knob. The water grew warmer. Warmer still. Hot. Actually hot. She stood there fully clothed, her hand under the stream, feeling water temperature she had only experienced once in her life years ago at a bathhouse in Yokohama before the war. Hot water was a luxury. Hot water was for the wealthy or the sick or special occasions. Hot water was not for prisoners. Slowly she undressed. She stepped under the spray. The heat hit her skin and something broke loose inside her chest. She gasped, then covered her mouth, then gave up and let the tears come. Around her, other women were doing the same, crying under showers that poured out unlimited hot water, as if water and fuel were so abundant they could be wasted on the comfort of enemy prisoners. Keiko stayed under that shower for 20 minutes. She washed her hair 3 times with the white soap that smelled like nothing she could name. Clean. It just smelled clean. She washed her body until her skin turned pink. She stood with her face directly under the spray and let the water run over her closed eyes and felt something that might have been joy, or might have been grief, or might have been both at once. When she finally stepped out, when she dried herself with a towel so rough it almost hurt, when she put on the clean cotton dress that had been provided, she felt like a different person. Not new exactly, but less covered in the accumulated filth of war, less carrying the weight of Guam's caves and desperate hunger and fear that never ended. That evening they walked to the mess hall, a large building with long tables and benches and windows that let in the golden late afternoon light. The smell hit them from 50 feet away. Meat cooking, bread baking, coffee brewing. Keiko's stomach clenched with an anticipation that was almost painful. Inside, American soldiers sat at some tables eating and talking in low voices. At other tables, camp staff ate. Kitchen workers in white aprons moved between a serving line and the tables carrying fresh trays of food. Everything was orderly, calm, normal. The Japanese women got in line. A large man stood behind the counter, a cook with forearms like hams and a face red from kitchen heat. Chef Kowalski, though Keiko wouldn't learn his name for weeks. He scooped food onto trays with practiced efficiency. Soup, thick vegetable soup with chunks of beef visible in the broth. Bread, 2 slices of white bread with butter already melting on the surface. Meat, some kind of roasted meat with gravy. Potatoes, green beans, a glass of milk, a piece of cake. Keiko carried her tray to a table and sat. She looked at the food. More food than she had seen in months. More food than her family would have for a week. She picked up her spoon and tasted the soup. The broth was rich, salty, hot. The beef was tender. The vegetables were soft but not mushy. She ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to memorize every flavor. Across the table, Hana was crying silently into her soup. Next to her, another woman was eating with shaking hands, unable to control the tremors of relief and confusion in something like shame. Yuki sat 2 tables away. She had taken food but wasn't eating. She just stared at her tray with an expression Keiko couldn't read. Anger, maybe? Or despair? Or the look of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing one meal at a time. Keiko watched as Chef Kowalski scraped leftover bread into a large trash bin. Entire pieces, whole slices that were perfectly good but apparently not worth saving. He did it casually without thought, the way someone might brush crumbs off a table. That bread alone would have fed a family in Yokohama for 2 days. He threw it away. She wanted to ask him why, but she didn't speak English yet. That question would have to wait 3 months when the answer would make her cry all over again. If you remember food rationing during or after World War II, share your memories below. These women had never seen abundance like this. Can you imagine that shock? The next morning, medical examinations began. The camp hospital was a low building with actual glass windows and clean white curtains. Inside, examination rooms lined a hallway. The smell of disinfectant and rubbing alcohol filled the air. Not the overwhelming stench of military hospitals where wounded men died faster than doctors could treat them. Just the normal, clean smell of a place where medicine happened under controlled conditions. Dr. Robert Chen was 38 years old, Chinese-American from San Francisco. He had volunteered for military service in 1942 and spent 3 years treating soldiers in the Pacific Theater. Now he was here at Camp McCoy checking on the health of women who had been enemies last month and were now just patients who needed care. Keiko was called into his examination room mid-morning. Dr. Chen gestured for her to sit. He spoke through Mr. Hayashi, his voice professional but not unkind. "I'm going to do a basic health check. Height, weight, general physical condition. It won't hurt. If anything makes you uncomfortable, just let me know." He measured her height first. 5 feet 3 inches, 160 centimeters. Average for a Japanese woman. Then the scale. Keiko stepped on. Dr. Chen adjusted weights on a balance bar until it leveled out. He wrote something on a clipboard. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Concern, maybe. 92 pounds, he said through the interpreter. 42 kilograms. Keiko nodded. That sounded right. She had been heavier before the war, maybe 50 kilograms. But 42 seemed reasonable given everything that had happened. Dr. Chen sat on a stool and looked at her directly. "Keiko, by American medical standards, you are severely malnourished. Dangerously so." She blinked. "But I'm a military nurse. I'm healthier than most of my colleagues." "I believe you, but that doesn't change the fact that your body is undernourished to the point where it's affecting your bone density, muscle mass, and organ function. We're going to put you on a supplemental diet. Extra protein, vitamins, calcium. You need to gain at least 10 pounds, preferably 15. Keiko sat very still. She was sick. Sick by their standards. Sick even though she felt relatively fine. Which meant everyone else was even sicker. Which meant Japan had been so depleted, so starved, that they didn't even know what healthy looked like anymore. Dr. Chen pulled out a large chart, 2 columns of numbers, one labeled Average American Female, one labeled Japanese Female POWs, Camp McCoy. Height, 163 centimeters versus 157 centimeters. Weight, 61 kilograms versus 41 kilograms. The differences went on: bone density, muscle mass, dental health, lifespan estimates. Every single category showed Americans ahead, not by a little, by margins so wide they seemed like different species. Keiko heard herself asking a question before she realized she was going to speak. "These American women, are they specially selected athletes, wealthy families?" Dr. Chen shook his head. "These are averages, normal women, secretaries, teachers, factory workers, housewives. This is just what happens when people have enough food." The room tilted slightly. Keiko gripped the edge of the examination table. "Are you all right?" Dr. Chen leaned forward, concerned. "If this is average," Keiko whispered, "and we thought we were normal, then we were dying. We were dying and we didn't even know it." Dr. Chen didn't disagree. He just made a note on his clipboard and told her she could go. Keiko walked out of the hospital into bright September sunshine. The air was cool. The sky was blue. Birds sang in the pine trees. Everything looked peaceful and normal and completely unchanged. But she felt like the ground had dropped out from under her feet. That chart destroyed Keiko's last defense. But she still didn't understand why the gap was so big. The answer would come in 2 days in a lecture that would make 289 women scream, cry, and finally understand. The next few days fell into a routine. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work assignments from 9 to noon, lunch, rest period, optional English classes from 3 to 5, dinner at 6, free time until lights out at 10. The work assignments were not difficult. Laundry, cleaning, helping in the kitchen, tending small vegetable gardens, simple tasks that kept hands busy without being exploitative. The women were paid a small amount tokens that could be used at the camp store for toiletries and candy and writing paper. Keiko was assigned to the camp medical clinic. She worked alongside American nurses, learning their techniques, watching how they treated patients with a kind of methodical care she had never witnessed in Japanese military hospitals, where supplies were always short and time was always running out. Sarah Mitchell was 28, a Red Cross nurse from Ohio. She had kind eyes and steady hands and patience that seemed infinite. She showed Keiko how to properly bandage wounds using American techniques, how to prepare injections with precision, how to sterilize instruments in an autoclave instead of just boiling them. The smell of iodine became familiar. The bright electric lights that let you actually see what you were doing became normal. The abundance of bandages and gauze and medical tape stopped being shocking and started being just how things were. Sarah spoke slowly when Keiko was nearby, using simple words, gesturing when necessary. Over time, Keiko started to understand without the interpreter. Basic words. Patient. Medicine. Careful. Good. One afternoon, Private Jim Walker came to the clinic with a cut on his hand. Nothing serious, just a deep scratch from working on a truck engine. He sat patiently while Sarah cleaned and bandaged the wound. Keiko assisted, handing over supplies, watching the procedure. Jim was 27 years old, from Iowa, from a farming family. He had joined the Army in 1943, served in the Pacific, seen things he didn't talk about. Now he was here, waiting for discharge papers, helping maintain vehicles and buildings in a camp for enemy prisoners. When Sarah finished, Jim looked at Keiko. He spoke slowly. "Thank you." Keiko understood those words. She nodded. Jim pulled out his wallet and extracted a photograph. Creased and worn from being carried through a war, he held it out. "My family, Iowa, farm." The photograph showed 5 people standing in front of a white farmhouse. A man and woman in their 50s, probably his parents. 3 younger people, Jim and 2 siblings maybe. Everyone was smiling. Behind them, fields stretched to the horizon. A barn, a tractor, a tree sitting at the father's feet. Keiko took the photograph, carefully holding it by the edges. She studied the faces. They looked happy, healthy, normal. Just a family on a farm in a place called Iowa. Jim pointed to each person. Father, mother, brother, sister, me. Then he pointed to Keiko and raised his eyebrows. A question through Mr. Hayashi, who happened to be nearby. Keiko answered. "My parents are in Yokohama. My mother paints pottery. My father makes tea bowls. My brother died at Saipan in June 1944. Jim's face changed. The easy smile faded. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke and Mr. Hayashi translated. "I lost my best friend at Okinawa. We grew up together, played baseball together. He was supposed to be the best man at my wedding someday." He paused. "War is terrible." Keiko looked at him, really looked at him, not as an enemy, not as a guard, just as another person who had lost someone. She saw grief in his eyes that matched her own. "Yes," she said in English, one of the few words she knew. "Terrible." Jim nodded. He took the photograph back, but as he did, he turned it over. On the back, written in pencil, was an address. Walker Farm, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He made a writing gesture with his hand, then pointed to the address, then to Keiko. "An offer. If you ever need help, write to me." Keiko felt tears prick her eyes. She couldn't speak. She just nodded. Jim smiled, a sad kind of smile. "Friend," he said, pointing to himself, then to her. "Friend," Keiko repeated. He left. Keiko stood holding the image of that address in her mind. A farm in Iowa. A place so far from Guam and Yokohama and all the places where people had died. A place where maybe somehow enemies could become something else. She would remember this moment 6 months from now, when everything changed again. But for now, she just went back to work, her heart feeling slightly less heavy than before. September 7th, 1945. 2 days after arriving at Camp McCoy, the women were assembled in a large hall normally used for recreational activities. Folding chairs had been set up in rows. A blackboard stood at the front of the room. Lieutenant David Miller, 33 years old, former high school history teacher from Michigan, stood beside the blackboard holding a piece of chalk. The women filed in nervously. Mandatory attendance, they had been told. An educational lecture about what no one had explained. Keiko sat near the middle. Hana sat beside her notebook, already open. Yuki sat in the back, arms crossed, face set in an expression of determined resistance. Lieutenant Miller waited until everyone was settled. He spoke through Mr. Hayashi, his voice clear and measured. The tone of a teacher, not a soldier. "Good afternoon. Today we're going to discuss the American economy and industrial production during World War II. I know some of you may believe that what you've seen here at Camp McCoy is staged, that we're trying to deceive you, that this food and these facilities are somehow special, not representative of America as a whole. He paused. I'm going to show you why that's not true. I'm going to show you numbers, facts, and I want you to understand that these numbers are from official records. I can provide documentation if anyone wishes to see it. He turned to the blackboard and began to write. Aircraft production, 19 bore, United States 96, 318, Japan 28, 180. The room went silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of shock. The silence of people doing math in their heads and not liking the answer. Miller continued writing, naval vessels 1942 to 1945, United States 2710, Japan 248, tanks and armored vehicles 1944, United States 88 410, Japan 2 515. The numbers kept coming. Ammunition production, steel production, oil refining capacity. Every category showed the same pattern. American production at levels that seemed impossible. Japanese production at levels that, seen in comparison, were almost laughable. Keiko stared at the blackboard. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Almost 100,000 aircraft in a single year. How was that even possible? Japan's factories had worked at maximum capacity and produced 28,000. America had produced more than 3 times that amount, while also fighting a war in Europe, while also feeding its population, while also maintaining civilian life at a level where children could eat ice cream and families could drive automobiles. Hana's pencil dropped. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed in the silent room. 3-1, Hana whispered. Just an aircraft. 3-1. She looked at Keiko, her face pale. They knew. Our generals knew. They had intelligence. They must have known these numbers or something close to them, and they sent us a fight anyway. A woman in the front row, Akiko, aged 25, a widow whose husband had died at Iwo Jima, stood up. Her voice shook. Why, if these numbers are true, why did they tell us we could win? Why did they send our husbands and brothers and sons to die in a war that was already lost? Lieutenant Miller met her eyes. I can't answer that, ma'am. I don't know what your leaders were thinking. But I can tell you that by any objective measure, by any rational calculation, Japan could not win this war. Not after 1942. Probably not even before that. Akiko's legs gave out. She sat down hard, her body shaking. Yuki stood up in the back. Her face was red. Her fists were clenched. She shouted in Japanese, her voice ragged. You're lying. This is propaganda. You're trying to break us. You're trying to make us hate our own country. Mr. Hayashi translated, though his voice was gentle. Lieutenant Miller didn't look angry. He just looked sad. I understand your reaction, Miller said. I would feel the same way. But these numbers are verifiable. I have documentation from both American and Japanese sources. You are welcome to review them. Yuki screamed something else, words tumbling over each other too fast to translate. Then she collapsed, just fell like a puppet with cut strings. 2 women caught her before she hit the floor. Lieutenant Wilson appeared from the back of the room with a medical bag. She knelt beside Yuki, checking her pulse, her pupils. Panic attack, she said quietly. Get her to the clinic. As they carried Yuki out, the rest of the room dissolved into chaos. Women crying, women shouting, women sitting in stunned silence with faces that had gone blank with shock. Keiko sat frozen. She stared at those numbers on the blackboard. 96, 318 aircraft. Her brother had died in June 1944, right in the middle of the year when America had built almost 100,000 planes. He had died thinking his sacrifice mattered, thinking Japan might still win, thinking his death served the emperor and the nation. He had died for numbers he never knew existed. She stood up slowly, walked down the aisle, walked right out of the hall into the September afternoon. The sun was shining. The air smelled like pine. Somewhere a bird was singing. She walked to the small chapel at the edge of camp. Not a religious building, exactly. Just a quiet room with benches where people could sit and think. She went inside. The light through the windows was golden and soft. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her brother's letter. The paper was thin from being folded and unfolded so many times. The ink was faded. She could barely read his handwriting anymore. Never trust the Western devils. But the Western devils hadn't lied to her. Her own country had lied. Her own generals had sent her brother to die in a war they knew couldn't be won. They had sent millions to die. They had starved their people. They had destroyed their cities, all while knowing with certainty that defeat was inevitable. Keiko's hands started to shake, then her whole body. She made a sound that was half sob, half scream. Then she tore the letter, right down the middle, then again and again, until it was just pieces, just fragments of paper that had once held her brother's final words. She let the pieces fall through her fingers onto the chapel floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered in Japanese. "I'm sorry, brother, but the enemy wasn't America. The enemy was the people who lied to us. The enemy was the people who knew we couldn't win and sent you to die anyway. That's the real enemy." She sat on a bench and cried until she had no tears left. Cried for her brother. Cried for all the brothers and husbands and sons who had died for numbers they never knew. Cried for a country that had betrayed its people by feeding them maws instead of truth. When she finally stood to leave, she felt lighter, emptied out, hollowed, but also somehow free. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky was orange and pink. Autumn was coming to Wisconsin. Soon there would be frost. Soon the leaves would turn color and fall. Soon everything would change. But Keiko was already changing, had been changing since that first breakfast on the ship, since hot showers with no time limit, since Dr. Chen's charts, since Jim's photograph, since Lieutenant Miller's numbers. She wasn't who she had been in Guam. She wasn't sure who she was becoming. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving toward truth instead of away from it, and that she thought walking back to her barracks in the fading light was something worth holding on to. October came to Wisconsin with a gentleness that had surprised Keiko. The air turned crisp but not cruel. Leaves on the oak trees shifted from green to gold to orange, then drifted down in slow spirals that reminded her of cherry blossoms in spring. Mornings brought frost that melted by noon, leaving the grass sparkling and wet. The sun still warmed the afternoons, but evenings required sweaters, and the wool blankets on their bunks became necessary rather than decorative. The camp settled into rhythms: work, meals, English classes, sleep, repeat. But beneath the routine, something was shifting. The women were changing. Not all at once, not uniformly, but changing nonetheless. 3 groups had formed distinct as the seasons. Keiko's group, about 150 women, had accepted what they could no longer deny. They attended English classes religiously. They volunteered for extra work duties. They asked questions about America, about democracy, about systems of government they had never been allowed to study. They were like students who had been given their first real textbooks after years of propaganda pamphlets. Hungry to learn, desperate to understand. Mrs. Helen Morrison taught the English classes. 52 years old, a retired elementary school teacher from Madison who had volunteered to help at the camp. She had gray hair worn in a soft bun, reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck, and a patience that seemed genuinely bottomless. She taught them the alphabet first, 26 letters that looked nothing like the characters Keiko had learned as a child. Strange symbols that somehow unlocked an entire language. A apple, B boy, C cat. Keiko repeated the words, her tongue struggling with unfamiliar sounds. The R sound especially gave her trouble. It came from the back of the throat in a way Japanese never did. She practiced walking back to her barracks. Red, rabbit, river, rain. After 6 weeks, she could write simple sentences. "My name is Keiko. I am from Japan. I want to learn." Mrs. Morrison praised every attempt, corrected every mistake with kindness. When Keiko successfully wrote her first full paragraph in English, Mrs. Morrison smiled so widely that her eyes disappeared into wrinkles. "Excellent work, Keiko. You're a natural." Keiko felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the heated barracks. Pride. Real pride. Not the manufactured pride of serving an empire, but the simple satisfaction of learning something difficult and doing it well. Hana's group, about 80 women, had moved beyond simple acceptance into active questioning. They spent their free time in the camp library, a small building with maybe 500 books. But those 500 books contained ideas that Japan had banned or burned or simply never allowed to exist. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Lincoln's speeches, books about democracy, about individual rights, about government, by consent of the governed, rather than divine mandate. Hana read everything she could find. She filled notebook after notebook with observations, questions, comparisons. Her handwriting got smaller and smaller as she tried to fit more thoughts onto each page. She no longer bothered with her code. What was the point? The dangerous ideas weren't hidden anymore. They were everywhere. She wrote long entries about the concept of inalienable rights, about the idea that government existed to serve people rather than people existing to serve government, about freedom of speech and press and religion. Ideas that seemed obvious once you encountered them, but revolutionary if you had never been allowed to consider them. One evening, she read a passage to Keiko from a book about American history. It says here that citizens can criticize their government, that it's not just allowed but encouraged, that dissent is considered patriotic rather than treasonous. She looked up, her eyes intense. Keiko, what if we had been allowed to question? What if someone could have stood up in 1941 and said, "This war is madness," and not been arrested? Would we have still fought? Keiko had no answer. The question was too large, too full of terrible possibilities. Yuki's group, the holdouts, numbered about 59. They refused to attend English classes. They refused to socialize with American staff. They ate the food because the alternative was starvation, but they did so with visible resentment, as if accepting calories from the enemy was a daily surrender that shamed them. They gathered in the evenings in a corner of the barracks and spoke only Japanese. They sang old songs. They clung to the idea that Japanese culture, Japanese spirit, Japanese essence remained superior even if Japanese industry and military power had proven inferior. They needed to believe this. Without it, they had nothing left to hold on to. Yuki was their unspoken leader. She sat at the center of their group, her face a mask of stubborn dignity. She had recovered from her collapse in the lecture hall, but had not recovered from what the numbers meant. She dealt with it by denying it mattered. So what if America could build more planes? Quantity wasn't quality. Numbers weren't spirit. Material superiority didn't equal moral superiority. Keiko watched her sometimes and felt a complicated mixture of pity and frustration. She understood the impulse to cling to old certainties. She had done it herself for weeks. But watching someone else do it, seeing the desperation and how tightly Yuki gripped her fading beliefs, made Keiko grateful she had let go. The question was whether Yuki would ever let go or whether she would hold on until those beliefs crushed her. October 31st, 1945, Halloween. The American staff had tried to explain the holiday to the Japanese women, a celebration where children dressed in costumes and went door to door asking for candy. It made no sense. Why would you give candy to children for showing up at your door? Why would children be allowed to wander the streets at night? Why would adults encourage this chaos? But on Halloween afternoon, children began appearing at the camp. The sons and daughters of staff members, of soldiers stationed nearby, of families from the town a few miles away. They came in costumes that ranged from elaborate to improvised. Pirates, princesses, cowboys, ghosts made from bed sheets with eye holes cut out, a small boy dressed as a soldier, his father's hat sliding down over his eyes. They had set up tables near the camp entrance, far enough from the barracks to maintain security, but close enough that the Japanese women could watch from behind the fence. American staff handed out candy from large bowls. The children shouted "trick or treat" with voices high and excited. Parents stood nearby chatting with each other, relaxed and smiling. Keiko stood at the fence with a dozen other women watching this strange ritual. The children were so healthy, so loud, so unafraid. They ran and laughed and demanded candy with the confidence of people who had never known hunger, never known fear, never known anything but abundance and safety. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, broke away from her parents and ran toward the fence. She wore a pink princess costume with a plastic crown and a wand with a star on top. Her cheeks were round. Her smile showed missing front teeth. She stopped a few feet from the fence and stared up at the Japanese women with open curiosity. "Are you from Japan?" she asked. The women looked at each other, not understanding. Mr. Hayashi happened to be nearby. He translated. Several women nodded. The girl reached into her candy bag and pulled out a chocolate bar. She walked right up to the fence and held it out through the chain link. "Happy Halloween. You should have candy too." Michiko was standing closest. She hesitated, looking at the chocolate like it might be a trap. Then slowly, carefully, she reached through the fence and took it. "Thank you," Michiko said in English. 2 words she had learned. The girl beamed. You're welcome. Your dress is pretty. Michiko was wearing one of the simple cotton dresses provided by the camp. Nothing special, nothing pretty. But the girl said it like she meant it. You're so pretty, the girl added, still smiling. Then her mother called. Emily, come back, honey. The girl waved a big, enthusiastic wave with her whole arm. Bye, happy Halloween. She ran back to her parents, her costume trailing behind her, already distracted by the next adventure. Michiko stood holding the chocolate bar like it was something precious, like it was something more than candy. Tears ran down her face. Keiko looked away from Michiko, and her gaze found Yuki. Yuki stood about 10 feet back from the fence. She had come to watch, even though she pretended not to care. She had seen the whole exchange. Her face was wet. She wasn't making any sound, wasn't acknowledging the tears at all, but they ran down her cheeks in steady streams. Keiko walked over at her. Yuki. Yuki didn't look at her. Her voice was barely a whisper. She's just a child. That little girl. She doesn't hate us. She doesn't even understand what we are. She just saw people and wanted to share candy. She finally turned to Keiko. They taught us American children were being raised to hate us, to see us as animals, but that little girl just saw people. Yes, Keiko said simply. I don't know what to do with that, Yuki said. I don't know how to fit that into anything I believed. Maybe you don't fit it in. Maybe you build something new. Yuki wiped her face with her sleeve. I'm tired, Keiko. I'm so tired of being angry, of holding on to things that keep breaking. But if I let go, who am I? I don't know, but you can find out. They stood in silence as the Halloween celebration continued. Children laughing, parents chatting, the ordinary life of ordinary people in an ordinary town, on an ordinary evening, in a country that had won a war and moved on to the business of living. That night after lights out, Yuki got up from her bunk. She walked through the dark barracks to where Lieutenant Wilson's office was. She knocked softly. Wilson answered, still in uniform, though it was nearly 10 o'clock. Yuki, is something wrong? Through Mr. Hayashi, who Wilson had called when she saw who was at the door, Yuki spoke. I want to learn English. Please, I want to join the classes. Wilson didn't show surprise. She just nodded. Classes are at 3 o'clock every afternoon. Mrs. Morrison will be happy to have you. Thank you. Yuki walked back to the barracks. Her friends in the holdout group pretended to be asleep, but Keiko knew they were listening. Tomorrow there would be consequences. Arguments, accusations of betrayal. The group would fracture further. But tonight Yuki just climbed into her bunk and pulled the blanket up to her chin. And for the first time in months, she fell asleep without the weight of anger pressing on her chest. November brought cold that Keiko had only read about. Temperatures dropping below freezing and staying there. Ice forming on puddles and lasting all day. Her breath visible in the air every morning. The Japanese women received winter coats, thick wool with buttons up the front. Gloves, scarves, boots lined with fleece. Even with the warm clothes, the cold was shocking. It bit at exposed skin. It made fingers ache. It turned the world into something harsh and unforgiving. But the barracks had furnaces that worked. Hot water remained unlimited. Meals became heartier, more filling. Stews and roasts and thick soups that warmed from the inside. December brought the first real snow. Keiko woke one morning to a world transformed. White everywhere. Snow piled on the ground, on the barracks roofs, on the fence posts, on the branches of pine trees that bent under the weight. The sky was gray but bright, and the snow kept falling in thick flakes that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Many of the women had never seen snow. They pressed their faces to the windows like children amazed and delighted, and slightly terrified of this strange white substance that apparently fell from the sky in America. They were allowed outside. They walked into the snow with tentative steps, feeling it crunch under their boots. Some bent down to touch it, scooping up handfuls and watching it melt against their warm palms. Others tilted their faces up to catch snowflakes on their tongues. Michiko made a snowball and threw it at another woman. It splattered harmlessly against her coat. For a moment, everyone froze, unsure if this was allowed. Then the other woman laughed and threw a snowball back. Within minutes, a dozen women were engaged in a snowball fight, their laughter echoing across the white landscape. Keiko stood apart just watching the snow fall. She had read about snow in books. Her brother had dreamed of seeing it someday. But he had died on a tropical island where it never got cold, where palm trees grew and rain fell warm. He would never see this, would never feel snow on his face, or make a snowball, or understand how beautiful winter could be. She wasn't crying, she had cried all her tears already. She just stood in the falling snow and felt the complicated weight of being alive when so many were not. February 1946, Winter Thanksgiving. Lieutenant Wilson had gathered the women in the mess hall for an announcement. Ladies, I know you're wondering why we've asked you here. In America, we have a holiday called Thanksgiving. Usually it's in November. It's a day when we think about what we're grateful for when we share a meal with family and friends. We missed the official date this year, so we're having what we call a winter Thanksgiving. Tomorrow evening, there will be a special dinner. American staff and Japanese prisoners will eat together. We want to thank you for your cooperation, your hard work, and your willingness to learn. And we want to acknowledge that the war is over. You're not our enemies anymore. Tomorrow, you're our guests. The next evening, the mess hall had been transformed. The usual long tables were covered with white tablecloths, real plates instead of metal trays, actual silverware, candles and glass holders, decorations made by American staff and Japanese women together, paper chains and drawings and small pine branches arranged in vases. The smell was overwhelming. Turkey, dozens of turkeys roasting in the kitchen ovens. The scent of sage and thyme and butter and meat filled the air so completely that Keiko felt dizzy from it. The women entered nervously, unsure of the protocol. American staff gestured for them to sit wherever they wanted. Mixed seating, no separation between guards and prisoners, just people at tables. Keiko found herself sitting between Sarah, the nurse she worked with, and Jim, who had specifically looked for her. Across the table sat Hannah and a young soldier from Kansas. Down the way, Yuki sat next to an older woman from the administrative staff. The food came out in waves. Turkey golden brown and glistening. Mashed potatoes whipped smooth with butter and cream. Gravy, stuffing with chunks of bread and vegetables. Green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls, and later pie. Apple pie and pumpkin pie with whipped cream on top. Jim helped himself to turkey and passed the platter to Keiko. His movements were casual, comfortable. He spoke in his slow, careful English that Keiko could mostly follow now. My family in Iowa, we always have turkey at Thanksgiving. This is a tradition, giving thanks for what we have. Sarah added, it's about gratitude, about recognizing the good things even when times are hard. Keiko cut a piece of turkey and tasted it. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that tasted like comfort somehow. Like something you would eat in a home, not a prison camp. She tried the mashed potatoes, smooth and rich and warm. The cranberry sauce was sweet and tart at the same time. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to the conversation around her. Jim talked about harvest season in Iowa. Sarah talked about her family in Ohio. The soldier from Kansas told a funny story about his first time cooking Thanksgiving dinner and burning the turkey so badly they had to order Chinese food. People laughed. Easy laughter, the kind that comes naturally when people are relaxed and well-fed and not afraid. Keiko looked around the room. Japanese women and American staff eating together, talking, some conversations going through interpreters, others happening in broken English and lots of gestures. Everywhere she looked, people were smiling. 6 months ago, these people had been enemies. 6 months ago, Keiko had believed Americans were demons who would torture her, rape her, kill her without mercy. 6 months ago, everything she knew was built on lies. Now she sat eating turkey with people who had treated her with more consistent kindness than her own government ever had. The cognitive dissonance should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like truth settling into place, like pieces of a puzzle finally making sense. At another table, something was happening. Thomas Reeves, age 30, from Pennsylvania, sat across from Yuki. Thomas had lost his left leg below the knee at Okinawa. He walked with a prosthetic, now a metal and wood contraption, that made a slight clicking sound with each step. He had volunteered to help at Camp McCoy because he wanted something to do while waiting for discharge, and because sitting at home thinking about the war made him feel like he was drowning. He had asked specifically to sit with some of the Japanese women, not out of anger, out of curiosity. He wanted to understand who these people were, these enemies he had fought, but never really known. Yuki had been placed across from him by chance. Or maybe by Lieutenant Wilson's careful planning. It was hard to say. They sat in silence for a while eating. Then Thomas spoke. Mr. Hayashi, circulating through the room, came over to translate. I hate war, Thomas said. I lost my leg. My brother died. I have nightmares most nights where I wake up screaming. He paused. But I don't hate you. You're not the war. You're just a woman who got caught up in something terrible, same as me. Yuki looked at him, at his missing leg, at his young face marked by things no young face should have to carry. She spoke in Japanese, and Mr. Hayashi translated. I'm sorry for all of it. For your leg, for your brother, for everything. Thomas shook his head. It's not your fault. You didn't start the war. You didn't make the decisions. You were just trying to survive, same as me. He paused. The people who started this war, who made us fight each other, they're the real enemy. Not you, not me, them. Yuki started crying. Not quietly, not politely. She put her face in her hands and sobbed. The sound carried through the mess hall. Several conversations stopped. People looked over. Thomas didn't know what to do. He glanced at Mr. Hayashi, who just nodded encouragingly. Awkwardly, Thomas reached across the table and put his hand on Yuki's shoulder. Just a gentle touch. Just human contact saying it's okay. Yuki looked up. Her face was wet and blotchy. She spoke through her tears, and Mr. Hayashi translated. You lost your leg fighting my country. And you're comforting me. How can you do that? Thomas smiled a sad kind of smile. Because holding on to hate is heavier than this metal leg. I tried it for a while, it almost killed me. So I let it go, and now I'm just trying to live, trying to be okay. Trying to believe that people can be better than the wars we fight. Yuki wiped her face. She stood up. Then slowly, carefully, she walked around the table. Thomas stood too, balancing on his prosthetic. Yuki held out her hand. Thomas looked at it. Then he took it. They shook hands across the table they had been sitting at. A man who lost his leg and a woman whose country took it. Shaking hands, choosing peace. The mess hall erupted in applause. Spontaneous, genuine applause from everyone there, Americans and Japanese alike. Because sometimes in the middle of all the pain and confusion and lingering anger, something happens that reminds people what humanity looks like. And it's worth applauding. This was the answer the lecture couldn't give. Not in numbers, but in this. A man who lost his leg could shake hands with a woman whose country took it, because both had learned the same truth. They weren't each other's enemy. Their leaders were. March 1946. Letters began arriving from Japan. The Red Cross had established mail service, carefully screened, slowly delivered. Not every woman received letters. Many families were too displaced, too destroyed, too dead. But some letters made it through. Keiko's letter came on a Tuesday. Thin paper water stained the writing shaky, her mother's handwriting barely legible. My dear daughter, we received word you are alive and in America. We thought you were dead. Thank the heavens you survived. Yokohama is gone. Our house is rubble. Father was injured in the March firebombing, but survived. We live in a shelter made from corrugated metal. We eat rice mixed with sawdust. Sometimes sweet potato stems. Yesterday we had a small fish split between 4 families. Father can barely walk. I try to find work, but there is none. Everyone is hungry. Everyone is sick. Keiko, you are lucky to be in America. Stay strong. We love you. Mother. Keiko read the letter 3 times. Each time the guilt grew heavier. She was eating turkey and mashed potatoes. Her parents were eating sawdust. She slept in a warm bed with clean blankets. They slept in a metal shelter. She was gaining weight and healing. They were starving and broken. She sat on her bunk holding the letter, crying silently. Hana came over, read the letter, and cried with her. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say. The injustice was too large for words. That night, Keiko couldn't eat dinner. She sat at the table staring at her food. Turkey again, green beans, bread, all of it perfect and abundant and completely impossible to swallow when she knew her parents were starving. Sarah noticed. Keiko, are you all right? Keiko showed her the letter. Sarah read it, her face falling. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. They're hungry. They're dying, and I'm here eating. How can I eat? Sarah put her hand over Keiko's. You eating doesn't make them hungrier. You starving yourself doesn't feed them. The best thing you can do is stay healthy, stay strong so that when you go home, you can help them. The logic was sound, but it didn't make the guilt lighter. April came with news. The women would be repatriated, sent home. Exact dates were still unclear, but probably May or June. The war had been over for 9 months. It was time to return them. The reactions were complicated. Joy at going home, fear of what home had become, relief at seeing family again, dread at leaving the abundance and safety of Camp McCoy. About 20 women, including Machiko, submitted formal requests to stay in America. All were denied. Geneva Convention required prisoners be repatriated unless they could prove their lives would be in danger upon return. Wanting to stay because America had better food wasn't grounds for asylum. Hannah completed her journal, 200 pages filled with observations, analysis, comparisons between Japanese and American systems of government. She titled it, From Darkness to Light, a Japanese POW in America. She wrote in both Japanese and English parallel translations, wanting the work to be accessible to both peoples. Lieutenant Wilson read the English portions. She sat in her office with the notebook open, tears running down her face. When she finished, she called Hannah in. "This is extraordinary. You should publish this. When you get home, when things stabilize, this needs to be published." Hannah nodded. "Maybe someday, when Japan is ready to hear it." Keiko spent her last weeks at Camp McCoy working in the medical clinic, learning everything Sarah could teach her. Modern techniques, American methods, better ways to treat infection, to set bones, to manage pain. She filled her own notebook with medical knowledge, determined to take something useful home. Yuki spent her last weeks in English class learning as much as she could. She had progressed from simple words to full conversations. Not fluent, but functional. She could ask questions. She could express ideas. She could connect with people across the language barrier. May 15, 1946, Departure Day. The women assembled in the early morning dressed in the clothes provided by the Red Cross. Each carried a small bag with 2 sets of clothing, toiletries, and $20 in American money. Everything they owned in the world fit in a bag they could carry in one hand. Lieutenant Wilson gave a short speech. "You came here as prisoners. You leave as friends. You've seen America. You've seen what we're about. Take that knowledge home. Build something better. Build peace, because the world can't survive another war like this." The goodbyes were hard, harder than anyone expected. Sarah hugged Keiko, both of them crying. "You're going to be an amazing doctor. Help your people. Heal them. And remember, you always have a friend in Ohio." Mrs. Morrison gave Hannah a dictionary, English to Japanese, Japanese to English, thick and heavy and precious. "Keep writing. The world needs your voice." Mrs. Anderson, the elderly volunteer who had brought cookies week after week, hugged Machiko. "Write to me, sweetheart. Promise me you'll write." Machiko sobbed into the old woman's shoulder. "I promise, Mother. I promise." Thomas shook Yuki's hand one more time. "Peace, Yuki. Real peace." "In peace, Thomas. Always in peace." Jim found Keiko by the bus. He held out the photograph of his family. "Keep it, so you remember you have friends in Iowa." Keiko tried to refuse. "This is yours, your family. And now you're part of that family. Keep it and write, please write." Keiko took the photograph. She hugged him, quick and awkward, then pulled back. "Thank you for everything, for being friend." "Always friends," Jim said. "No matter what." The buses pulled away. 289 women heading back to San Francisco, back to ships, back to Japan. Back to a country destroyed and starving and trying to rebuild from ashes. They looked out the windows at Camp McCoy disappearing behind them. At the pine forests and small towns, an ordinary American landscape they had lived in for 9 months. 9 months that had changed everything. Keiko held Jim's photograph carefully. Beside her, Hannah clutched her dictionary. Across the aisle, Yuki pressed her hand against the window in a gesture that might have been goodbye, or might have been gratitude, or might have been both. The train took them west across America one more time. The same route in reverse. But they weren't the same women who had made this journey 9 months ago. Those women had been full of fear and hate and lies. These women were full of truth and confusion and something that might eventually become hope. June 1946, Yokohama Harbor. The ship docked in a city that looked like a photograph of hell. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames. Entire neighborhoods flattened. Rubble everywhere. People moving through the ruins like ghosts, thin and pale and desperate. Keiko stood on the deck and stared at what remained of her home. Nothing looked familiar. The landmarks she had known her whole life were simply gone, erased. The city had been bombed so thoroughly that rebuilding didn't seem possible. It seemed like they would just have to start over from nothing. Families waited at the dock, small clusters of people hoping their daughters and sisters and wives had survived. Many faces showed disappointment when their person wasn't among those disembarking. Many showed joy when they were. Keiko saw her parents. Her mother looked 20 years older, her face deeply lined, her body bent. Her father limped badly, leaning on a cane made from a piece of pipe. They stood together, searching the crowd. Keiko walked down the gangplank. When her parents saw her, her mother screamed, a sound of pure relief and joy. They rushed forward as fast as her father could move. They hugged her, all three of them crying and holding each other. "You're alive," her mother kept saying. "You're alive. You're alive." They took her home, not to the house she remembered, that was rubble, but to a small shack made from salvaged wood and corrugated metal in what used to be their neighborhood. One room, no electricity, no running water, a small hibachi for cooking, thin futons on the floor. Her parents asked about America. Keiko tried to explain. Hot water with no limits, food at every meal, buildings 20 stories tall, cars everywhere, people who treated prisoners with kindness. Her father listened quietly. When she finished, he cried. "We were lied to. We knew, but we didn't want to believe. We sent millions to die for a war we couldn't win. I'm sorry, Keiko. I'm sorry we let them do that to you." That night, Keiko lay on the thin futon and stared at the ceiling. Outside, she could hear others in nearby shelters, coughing, crying, the sounds of a nation trying to survive. She thought about Camp McCoy, about warm beds and full meals, and Sarah's patient teaching, and Jim's photograph, which she had hidden carefully in her bag. About a place where even enemies could become friends if they were willing to see each other as human. Japan would rebuild. It would take years, maybe decades, but it would rebuild. And Keiko would help. She would go back to medical school, finish her training, become a doctor. She would teach young doctors the American techniques she had learned. She would help heal the people her country's leaders had sacrificed. She would live for truth, because her brother had died for lies, and someone had to balance that scale. On a spring morning in 1950, Keiko Yamada sat at her desk in a small clinic in Tokyo. 4 years had passed since she returned from America. 4 years of medical school, of building a practice, of helping Japan heal one patient at a time. On her desk in a simple frame was the photograph of Jim's family farm in Iowa. She kept it there as a reminder of where she had been, of what she had learned, of the fact that people could be better than their governments, kinder than their propaganda, more human than their wars. She picked up her pen and began writing another letter to Jim. She had written every few months since returning. He always wrote back, simple letters about farm life and his family and rebuilding tractors. She wrote about her patients in Japan's slow recovery and cherry blossoms blooming without the shadow of war hanging over them. Today she had good news to share. A young girl with a severe infection treated successfully using the American techniques Sarah had taught her. The girl would live, would grow up, would have a future. She ended the letter the way she always did. "The war divided us. Peace unites us. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for showing me that truth is stronger than lies. Always, Keiko." She sealed the envelope and set it aside to mail later. Then she called for her first patient of the day, a mother with a sick child, treatable, with medicine and knowledge and care completely treatable. Hannah had published her journal in 1948. From Darkness to Light became controversial immediately. Some called it treason, others called it necessary. But it sold and it made people think. She continued writing, becoming a voice for democracy, for education reform, for learning from defeat, and building something better. Yuki opened a small school in Osaka where she taught English to children. Not just vocabulary and grammar, but the importance of questioning, of seeking truth, of never blindly accepting what authorities told them. She taught them the lesson she had learned too late, that asking questions wasn't disloyalty, it was survival. Keiko got to work. healing one person at a time, building peace one small act of kindness at a time. Living the truth she had learned in a place called Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, where breakfast had changed everything. They had come to America as prisoners carrying hatred and lies. They left as witnesses carrying truth and hope. The war wasn't defeated just by weapons. It was defeated by breakfast, by hot showers, by a farmer's kindness, by a soldier's photograph, by one little girl in a princess costume. The war was defeated by truth, and 289 women became warriors of that truth, not with guns, but with knowledge, courage, and the determination to never let the next generation be lied to as they were. If your family served in World War II, if they met former enemies, if they chose kindness over revenge, share their story below. Because these stories, these moments of truth defeating lies are what make us human, and America at its best has always chosen truth.